Welcome back to Coffee Talk with Brandy. This is take 3. We are having some technical difficulties with some apps that I was trying to use. I paid for an app and it will only allow me to record 10 minutes. So I'm really frustrated, but so we'll eventually get it right. But welcome back. I'm Brandy, Coffee Talk with Brandy. This is Kathleen. She's one of my good friends and she is my co-host who flew up from Arizona to be co-host with me for a couple of sessions, tapes, films, whatever, a couple of shows. And she'll be making her way to my show several times throughout Coffee Talk with Brandy because it's fun. And Kathleen and I met about 20 years ago when she was the University of Oregon Duck. And she's going to tell us a little bit about that story, what a fun story, and tell us a little bit about how you became the Duck.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I was a freshman at the University of Oregon and had a scholarship for tuition. And so my plan was to figure out how I could get a full ride. So the second I was going to be an RA my sophomore year, and then if I got to be the Duck mascot, they'd pay for books. So technically it would be a full ride. I wouldn't have to pay for anything. So I tried out to be the Duck, and you just do a performance in front of the cheerleading coach, a couple other people as well, maybe some former mascots as well as current ones, and then some cheerleaders too. And then you had like a one-on-one interview. And so I went back to my dorm room and waited for the call. Back then they had landlines into the dorm room.
Oh,
so you had landlines. You had to wait for the call.
That's dating us.
It is very much so. So anyway, so I waited for the call. I got the call and I was the alternate. So I wasn't a main Duck because there's about 4 or 5 of us. And so I was able to get my practice, tryouts, so to speak, and do community events and then some sporting events. And then I was able to do it for 3 years. So sophomore, junior, and senior year of college.
Yeah, it was so fun because, us girls, we actually went to the same religion for a while. And Kathleen and I share a lot of a similar story, just in that we both have come to realize that we were living the life that everybody else told us to live. We weren't living our lives for ourselves. We were just doing what was taught to us through, whether it's religion or, the social constructs in families and all of that stuff. And so we've had these aha moments. And one of the reasons why she's really excited about Coffee Talk with Brandy is because we want to bring these conversations to the forefront. We want to be able to teach and just role model for other people what it's like to become self-aware, and what is it like to live your life for yourself. How do you move past fear? Like all of these things, like taking what we hear in conversations on such a surface level and digging deeper. So come along, like, follow, share, subscribe, come along on our journey and the journey that I have with my guests, because it's going to be really fun. So Kathleen, back to the Duck story.
Yes.
I got rabbit hole sometimes. But she had the Duck uniform. So there were times I was living with a bunch of girls, a couple of my girlfriends, and she'd come over. It was Christmas, and we got pictures with the Duck in front of the Christmas tree because
it was decorated in U of O colors, and it was a beautiful tree. And so if you've got a U of O themed Christmas tree, you do need the Duck to show up to your house. And
that's so funny.
Approve of that.
Right? And not too long ago, she actually sent me some of those pictures. And so it just reminded me of just memories. I mean, I forget, like, I didn't take pictures that much back then. And I mean, I take them now all the time because I have my cell phone, but I hated myself in pictures back then, number one. So maybe that's a reason why. And that's another story. But but it was so fun, the Duck, Kathleen. So moving forward, though, and talking a little bit about Coffee Talk with Brandy, do you have an aha moment that happened for you that gave you just the lens of shifting everything that you were doing in your life? And what was that like?
I do. And the moment it happened in 2012. I was pregnant with my 3rd son, been married for quite some time, already had 2 kids. And so at that moment, the aha moment came when I realized that the decisions that I was making with my personal relationships were going to cause my trajectory to be alone and by myself as an adult, like older adult. And that was a catalyst for me to want to improve change, become a better person, but also understand what I needed to resolve in my life in order to become the person I wanted to be. Because at that point, I was alienating everyone around me. And so it was very, I would say, emotionally shut down. So I was emotionally shut down, unavailable, not only to my husband at the time, but also my children. And I wasn't willing to risk my family in order to hold on to past trauma, but also fear.
Yeah.
So
Let's kind of dive for a second because you said you were shut down. Let's hold some space for a moment that when we're shut down, there's a reason why. Like, we tend to want to shame people for emotions and feelings. And I just know myself as a mom, sometimes when I've been at that moment where I've shut down, I was kind of judgmental towards myself because I couldn't give and be the person I wanted to be. But really, when we're shut down, it's a survival mechanism.
it is.
It's helping us to do what we need to do in order to survive, to move forward. So if you would share, like, in that moment of feeling shut down, like, what was the barrier for you, do you think? Like, what was keeping you from...
I know. When I was a teenager, I was 14 years old, and I'd never had a boyfriend. I never dated anybody. I mean, I was very, very innocent. And there was an older boy who took an interest in me sexually and pursued me. And so my very first kiss was from someone I wasn't romantically interested in. And he took his tongue and put it down my throat and slobbered on my face, and it was pretty bad. I was shocked.
Yeah.
And then I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know how to, shut it down. That didn't even cross my mind. So he continued to pursue me. I continued to say, okay, come over.
Yeah.
Because I believe in the fight, flight, and freeze response. And I think myself, I froze.
Yeah.
And so there was another moment where he and I drove to an isolated area and took me out and sat me down, and he unzipped his pants and had me touch his hard penis, and he put his hands on my breasts under my shirt and then made sexual comments towards me at the time, and I froze.
Yeah.
Because it goes from never being kissed, never being touched, to now being kissed and touching. And when he said that he wanted to look at my breasts, I said no, and he respected that. And then we had the quiet drive back to my house where he took me home and dropped me off, and I never said anything for years. And so I wrote in my journal, what did I do wrong? What did I do to ask for this? And I shamed myself, because girls and women, we do that. What did we do? Because we must have done something to warrant this unwanted sexual attention. And so what happened is over the course of years, I emotionally shut down and then made myself unavailable to anyone, unavailable to myself, and then unavailable to my husband in the marriage that I was in, and to everyone around me. So my relationships, I would say, at best, were cold, but because I was cold inside as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and that shutdown phase is really to protect ourselves. So you had that aha moment, and there was a reality that you had some trauma that needed to really be attended to. Well, thank you for sharing that. And it happens so often to women.
It does.
To girls.
Well,
and it happens to men too. Statistically, 1 in 4 boys are messed with sexually as well.
Yeah,
and it's similar to women.
And here's the thing: is that what happens is when you start talking about it. Like, I didn't talk about it for over 15 years. Like, I had mentioned it one time to a religious leader in the religious organization that I was a part of, because again, I had shamed myself. So I was 18, 19 years old, and the leader of the church, bishop, said oh, it's not your fault. So, and that was it. I didn't tell my parents until I was in my 30s. And so, because I realized that was a catalyst for what had happened. But as soon as I started talking about it, I realized women have these experiences so much more frequently than we are willing to even talk about or acknowledge. And as soon as I was able to say things like exactly the graphic description of what had happened, I can free other women to share their similar experiences, because not all sexual experiences involve penetration. They
Yeah.
don't. And just because there wasn't, it was, would be considered like what, heavy petting, it didn't mean that I still didn't feel shame. Well, it wasn't like he raped you, right? Or it was sexual assault,
Yeah.
right? But it doesn't have to be. It was the fact that it was unwanted, and it was a shock
It was
to
not
my
consensual.
system. Then what happened at school, he told his friends, and then I found out about, being talked about, and again, shamed and bullied at school by him and his friends who were upperclassmen. What could I do?
Yeah.
And so then I not only did I have to endure the shame that I put on myself from allowing this to happen, then I had to show up to school every day knowing that he was there talking about me to his friends, and that they knew as well. And that when I saw him and his friends in the hall, I knew they knew.
Yeah.
And then encounter that shame as well.
Yeah. And it's just this repeated cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like finding those things in life that really shift us from the froze perspective
Mm-hmm.
to how do I move forward perspective.
Right. So that's the question. How do you go from being emotionally frozen, right, as a response? And it's same thing, right? Fight or flight.
Yeah.
Think about all the women out there who have fought, not necessarily fought the person who's persecuting them or sexually pursuing them, but they fight other people in their lives, or we fear, right?
Yeah.
We hide. And you're right. Now what do I do? Now what do I do that I've acknowledged? I know where the pain, the trauma is coming from. I know that this was a stopping point for me to be able to personally move forward in emotional growth. Now what do I do? What do I do with that?
Yeah. What did you do? Did you reach out to a therapist?
Mm-hmm.
What did that look like? Okay.
Yeah. So therapy. At that time, we were struggling in our marriage, and we went to a marriage counselor. And at that time, I knew something was up. Again, me personally. And what had happened was we saw the counselor, and it was like the first or the second time. It might have been the first. I know the first time what happened was I went and sat down, and we went as a couple, and my husband he spoke for 45 minutes of the 50-minute session. So then the counselor turned and looked at me and said, "Now, what about you? How are you?" And I just started bawling. I started sobbing, and I knew something was very, very wrong. And at that point I said, I don't know what I say. I just said, I knew in my heart that I needed to pursue this, that I needed to pursue therapy. And then my husband said, I know what I need to do. I just need to do it. So he elected not to pursue marriage counseling at that time. And so I continued to see that counselor on a personal level. And I got a journal, and I started getting to work personally and just opening up my eyes to the changes that I needed to make, and started setting personal goals like, hey, what do you need me to do? Okay, I'll do this. And it meant having difficult conversations with my parents and with my husband about that particular experience.
Yeah. So that was the catalyst to make things move forward.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
It's so difficult in the face of trauma and shame. Shame keeps us thinking that we are bad people, and we're not.
Right.
Guilt is a little bit different. I've done something that's bad, whereas shame is I am bad. And when you have those experiences, which are unfortunately more common than we will talk about.
Yeah, but Brandy, as a teenager, like I said, 14, completely innocent.
Yeah.
How do you tell your parents, I touched a hard penis?
Yeah.
When you're like, I read the Babysitter's Club books.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where I was, right? Yeah. Like a few years back, I was reading the Babysitter's Club.
Yeah. Well, somebody took that innocence from you. Is what happened.
And that
happens often.
Oh, and it was so fast. It was so fast that as it was happening to my body, I just was like, what's going on? And in my mind, this is the hard part, because when I think about that experience, I think about in my mind, no, and I couldn't say the words
Right.
until some other stuff happened, and then I could. But I wanted to say no, and I couldn't mouth the words because I was frozen.
Right.
And so then I'm like, right, because the media, right, we're taught, oh, just say no, women, and it puts the onus on women,
On
when
us.
I believe men, women, everybody needs to learn how to ask for consent first,
Yes.
and not assume it's consensual until the person says no.
Yes. It's such a different world, right? We have to create different boundaries. We have to start having different conversations because it's not working. The things that are that's going on collectively, we know that statistically it happens often. And so many of us are shut down in relationships with friends or people, our lovers, our children. There are things that just keep us from living the life that we want to live because we're in that same shame cycle.
Well, and the
pain.
But it isn't recognizable. It wasn't recognizable to me that was like a problem in my marriage. Like, I got married at 25, and wait, what was I, like 32 at the time, right?
Yeah, so young.
It was still but it was years into the marriage. And then I'm like, this is the catalyst to my emotional, I don't know, what do you call it, the opposite of growth?
Stunned. You're emotionally
stunned. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So it stopped, and I thought, well, now I'm stopped, now I'm emotionally a 14-year-old in a 32-year-old's body.
Oh, yes, that is actually true. When we have a trauma, especially at a certain age, we tend to shut down growth emotionally because we get stunted in that way. So it's true. And then we think about just people in general in relationships, and it's so surface, right? And then when you start to realize surface just isn't enough, then you start asking deeper questions, and then you're like on the precipice of like what you figured out in your own life, which is then thrown all of that stuff, and you're like, what the hell do I do with this? This is so painful. I don't know what to do.
But it takes the time. I like that you said the surface level.
Oh yeah.
Because for years I chose surface level relationships that I was comfortable with. Friends that I knew, like men, right? Like, I look at my college buddies. There's a reason they were my really, really good friends, because I knew I could trust them, that they would never try anything sexually. They never made any advances. They weren't interested in me in that way. So I was automatically protected. And in high school, I gravitated towards gay men. Now, whether or not they knew it at the time, right?
Yeah.
Because it was the 90s. So at that time, there was one boy I asked to prom, and we went. He ended up coming out. Another one that I was going to go to, but he had moved. I think we were going to go to homecoming, but he had moved away. And good friends to this day that I still keep in touch with, that are near and dear to my heart. Yeah. But because I knew that the trust was already there, so I could freely give myself in a safe way. But it was because I was protecting that shame that I had created based on that experience. So by the time I was in my 20s and like ready to get married and settle down, then I found somebody else who was also emotionally unavailable.
Yeah. Well, and we gravitate towards what's familiar completely. We function from our subconscious, which is why these conversations with Coffee Talk with Brandy is really bringing that subconscious to the prefrontal cortex, which is our conscious, and making decisions and things based upon using your skills and understanding, like, why are you doing what you're doing? It's being conscious and aware of it, because we will keep doing the same pattern over and over again. It will be dressed up in a different package and we might think it looks different, but until we address what's going on, we'll continue the pattern. I mean, unless you just kind of get lucky one day and you meet somebody who is just on that same, which would be great. I mean, I would love that.
Okay, fair enough. Then the question becomes, how do you make the transition then from going from what's familiar to what's not familiar and terrifying. How do you do that?
Right? Because
no, I'm asking you.
Well, it's terrifying. It's true. It is
so terrifying
because it's scary, right?
Yes.
And it can be comfortable when you're living in an experience that is similar to what you grow up in. Even if it was abusive, even if it was, somebody yelling obscenities at you, if that is what you know, that becomes comfortable. So being outside of something that is calm, or being in something that's calm can feel really overwhelming. So it's interesting. I used to work with families a lot, and something that would come up and people would say was like, oh, this person just likes drama. And it really rubbed me the wrong way, number one, because I love the people I work with. And if somebody would say something like that about somebody I worked with, I'm like, first of all, then why don't you pull out your curiosity? Because it's normal for them to be in chaos. Without the presence of chaos, it can feel really uncomfortable. So I guess to answer your question, it's becoming aware of the pattern. It's becoming like, oh my gosh, what am I feeling? Because we're detached from our emotions and our feelings when we've lived in chaos, because it's a survival mechanism. So we detach from all that, and we are not in tune with our gut instinct. And so when we start to ask questions that allow us to become aware of who we are, that will put us on the path to move forward into choosing a different path. But from my experience, it's not easy work. I've been in therapy 15 years now. I rarely see my therapist, but as of COVID right now, and there's just a lot going on with my daughter's health, there's so much on my plate right now. I'm seeing her again. And I still have things that I need to work on, like boundaries. We talked about it's hard to say no. Why is it so hard to say no? Well, did we grow up in homes where
it's okay
you weren't
to
allowed to say no? You had to do it. You had to eat that food. You had to do that. You had to hug that uncle that you didn't want to hug. All of those things. You don't learn to instinctively. You detach from your gut instinct to do what people want you to do to appease the people you're around.
Correct.
And therefore, we drop our authenticity.
That's right.
To keep the attachment.
But you keep the level of comfortability that others are accustomed to, when the true growth only happens when you're uncomfortable. And I think that is the cycle of trauma that happens from generation to generation to generation. The one example that I always like to use is the old clean up your plate adage that started, or maybe it was before, when food was scarce back in the Depression, right? So my grandparents, who did grow up in the Depression, taught my parents to clean up their plates. So by the time I was growing up in the 80s, I had to clean up my plate. And now my kids growing up in, 2010, what are they called? The tens, right? Now here we start over again. And I'm like, wait a second. I didn't grow up in the Depression. My parents didn't grow up in the Depression. Why am I teaching my kids to clean their plates instead of listening to their bodies when they're full and saying, what do you think? Are you done eating? And that's just a small example of trauma passed down from generation to generation. Imagine all the examples that you think about personally, or that you've heard through your experience. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's passed down genetically. So even though there might be repeated patterns, it's phenomenal to me to think about, because I'm such a nerd like that, but it's literally passed down in our genetics, like memories.
Right.
And that's just incredible to think about, not like on a cool, I mean, it's a cool factor in the fact that, holy cow, like you can have the same things go on from generation to generation.
Right.
And then it's like we have to, awaken ourselves if we want to shift that freaking pattern.
Right.
And heal our family, our generation, our lineage, and all of that stuff. And that's kind of the conversation.
An uncomfortable conversation. Do you know how hard it was for me to tell my parents about what happened to me when I was 14? And had that conversation. But it allowed me the opportunity to work through my emotional problems that I had and the distance that I had created between myself and my parents, but to also move through that. And now I'm like, I can talk about it because it's an experience, it happened, but I don't have any emotional connection with that anymore. And I don't know whatever happened to that boy, right? I don't
Yeah.
know, and I don't harbor ill will anymore. I mean, he could, I don't know, he married, have a family of his own.
Yeah.
And that's on him, but I can release that. So I'm not angry or upset anymore. And it feels good. It feels good to be able to talk about it without being emotionally attached to it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to kind of end here, because when we can talk about the stories in our lives with like, this was just an experience that happened, and the emotions kind of not there, there's healing that has happened.
True.
From my own perspective, my personal perspective, as well as the peer lens. And you know, it feels good, and I think it's important. There are times things can sneak up and we don't really realize something's there, but anytime, just as we wrap this up, and we'll continue in the next session, but thinking about like, when we have things that come up, and it can be hard and difficult, right, when we're feeling that, and you know, reach out to somebody. I mean, I'm not encouraging people to do this on their own. It's just like, be gentle with the messages that come up in your own mind and thought, because there's a reason that's there, and examining it in the presence of somebody who's safe, or just by yourself for a while, whatever that is for you. I mean, you have to do what's best for you.
I totally recommend therapy, and finding a therapist that you connect with. And if you don't have one, then go to the next one and the next one till you find somebody. And that was the difference.
Yeah.
Is because I knew I could trust this person with the issues that I needed to work through. Yeah. And ironically, it wasn't it wasn't even that particular experience that we really worked through. It was other issues. So that's what happens, right? Yeah. Therapy, you get to open up yourself, but you also get to heal yourself too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And then you start making decisions that are based upon conscious thoughts versus a repeated pattern, because you're aware. And although it still can happen, I have my days where I slip back into, and I'm like, what was I doing? But it's a gentle. It's a gentle.
Me too.
I'm like, it's gentleness with me. I'm like, okay, well, this is just
a journey.
It is a journey, and we're humans. So until next time, besties. Hope you have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye. Let's see if I can turn this off. Oh, maybe.